Simone Carter is a resilient single mother running a modest street food stall, struggling to keep her head above water while raising her daughter, Zuri. When she spots a young boy, Mateo, wandering the dangerous streets in tattered clothes, her maternal instincts override her financial stress. She feeds him for free, unaware that the boy's poverty is a disguise used to test the intentions of those around him. The boy's father is Luca Santoro, a mafia boss with a violent temper and a cold heart. Having observed Simone's genuine kindness and her fierce defense of his son against an entitled customer, Luca decides he wants that warmth in his own cold world. He doesn't just offer her a job. He uses his power to force Simone and her daughter into his high-security mansion under the guise of protection and employment. As Simone softens the edges of the Santoro household, she finds herself drawn to the dangerous man behind the braids, until a ruthless ghost from Luca's past arrives to claim his throne and his heart. The rhythmic clatter of Simone's heavy cast-iron pans hitting the burner filled the humid morning air like a heartbeat. Simone Carter moved through her small street food stall with a fluid, practiced grace that turned the chaos of a morning rush into a dance. Her hands were a blur of motion, chopping fresh ginger, tossing vibrant bell peppers into the heat, and stirring her signature savory soy glaze that sent a magnetic aroma drifting through the crowded market. Above the stall, a modest wooden sign hand-painted with the words "Zuri's Heart" swung gently in the breeze. It was the kind of spot where the city's dualities met. Weary laborers in dust-covered boots stood shoulder to shoulder with bank tellers in crisp shirts, all drawn by the scent of a meal that promised more than just calories. Simone paused for a second to tuck a stray, springy curl back under her pink satin bonnet and wiped the persistent beads of sweat from her forehead. The city heat was already beginning to bake the asphalt, but inside the stall, standing over the open flames of her gas range, it was a different kind of intensity. It was the kind of heat that made her deep brown skin glisten and her white sleeveless top cling to her back. She was a striking woman, though she rarely looked in a mirror long enough to realize it. With high cheekbones and eyes the color of dark, polished mahogany, she possessed a soft, feminine warmth that most people felt before they even placed their order. But Simone didn't have the luxury of time for compliments. She had a mountain of debt to climb and a 7-year-old daughter named Zuri to protect. "Yo, Simone, let me get the usual ginger soy bowl, and don't be stingy with the extra sauce," a voice called out. Simone looked up to see Marcus, a regular who worked the shipping docks nearby. "Marcus, you know that extra glaze is going to cost you a smile," she teased, already expertly portioning out a steaming mound of jasmine rice. "Sister, I'd pay triple for this," Marcus laughed, the sound warm and contagious. "My mother is starting to ask why I don't eat at her table on Tuesdays anymore. Tell her she's welcome to come by." "I don't keep secrets with my spices," Simone replied, packing the bowl high with tender braised beef and vibrant greens. As Marcus handed her the cash, he looked at the growing line and shook his head. "This stall can't hold you forever, girl. You need a real roof over your head." Simone just offered a tired smile and moved to the next customer. She had heard it all before, but real restaurants required real capital. The kind she didn't have after a life of hard knocks had left her with nothing but her recipes and her pride. The rush was finally starting to thin when she felt a strange weight on her, the sensation of being watched. She looked past the counter and saw him. About 10 feet away, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 6 stood perfectly still. He was beautiful, with smooth skin and the biggest, most expressive eyes Simone had ever seen, but he looked like a ghost. His white t-shirt was thin and riddled with visible holes, and his feet were covered in shoes that had seen far better days. Despite the obvious signs of hardship, the boy didn't beg. He just stood there with his mouth slightly open in amazement, watching the steam rise from the pans as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Something about his stillness, a quiet, haunting loneliness, hit Simone right in the chest. She leaned out of the small service window, her maternal instincts flaring to life. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, melodic hum. "You okay? Where's your mommy?" The boy's eyes snapped to hers, startled, as if he hadn't expected to be seen. He didn't answer, but his gaze drifted back to the food with a look of pure, raw hunger. Simone didn't need to hear his story to know it. She looked at her nearly empty containers, then back at the boy. Without a word, she turned back to the flame, pulling together the last of her ingredients to create a bowl of magic just for him. If you want to know what happens in the next chapter, where the mysterious mafia boss makes his presence known, Hit the subscribe button, drop your comment, share and like. Let me take you to the street stall magic where Simone's daily struggle and the moment she meets the hungry Matteo. The rhythmic clatter of Simone's heavy cast-iron pans hitting the burner filled the humid morning air like a heartbeat. Simone Carter moved through her small street food stall with a fluid, practiced grace that turned the chaos of a morning rush into a dance. Her hands were a blur of motion, chopping fresh ginger, tossing vibrant bell peppers into the heat, and stirring her signature savory soy glaze that sent a magnetic aroma drifting through the crowded market. Above the stall, a modest wooden sign hand-painted with the words Zuri's Heart swung gently in the breeze. It was the kind of spot where the city's dualities met. Weary laborers in dust-covered boots stood shoulder to shoulder with bank tellers in crisp shirts, all drawn by the scent of a meal that promised more than just calories. Simone paused for a second to tuck a stray, springy curl back under her pink satin bonnet and wiped the persistent beads of sweat from her forehead. The city heat was already beginning to bake the asphalt, but inside the stall, standing over the open flames of her gas range, it was a different kind of intensity. It was the kind of heat that made her deep brown skin glisten and her white sleeveless top cling to her back. She was a striking woman, though she rarely looked in a mirror long enough to realize it. With high cheekbones and eyes the color of dark, polished mahogany, she possessed a soft, feminine warmth that most people felt before they even placed their order. But Simone didn't have the luxury of time for compliments. She had a mountain of debt to climb and a 7-year-old daughter named Zuri to protect. "Yo, Simone, let me get the usual ginger soy bowl, and don't be stingy with the extra sauce," a voice called out. Simone looked up to see Marcus, a regular who worked the shipping docks nearby. "Marcus, you know that extra glaze is going to cost you a smile," she teased, already expertly portioning out a steaming mound of jasmine rice. "Sister, I'd pay triple for this," Marcus laughed, the sound warm and contagious. "My mother is starting to ask why I don't eat at her table on Tuesdays anymore. Tell her she's welcome to come by." "I don't keep secrets with my spices," Simone replied, packing the bowl high with tender braised beef and vibrant greens. As Marcus handed her the cash, he looked at the growing line and shook his head. "This stall can't hold you forever, girl. You need a real roof over your head." Simone just offered a tired smile and moved to the next customer. She had heard it all before, but real restaurants required real capital. The kind she didn't have after a life of hard knocks had left her with nothing but her recipes and her pride. The rush was finally starting to thin when she felt a strange weight on her, the sensation of being watched. She looked past the counter and saw him. About 10 feet away, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 6 stood perfectly still. He was beautiful, with smooth skin and the biggest, most expressive eyes Simone had ever seen, but he looked like a ghost. His white t-shirt was thin and riddled with visible holes, and his feet were covered in shoes that had seen far better days. Despite the obvious signs of hardship, the boy didn't beg. He just stood there with his mouth slightly open in amazement, watching the steam rise from the pans as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Something about his stillness, a quiet, haunting loneliness, hit Simone right in the chest. She leaned out of the small service window, her maternal instincts flaring to life. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, melodic hum. "You okay? Where's your mommy?" The boy's eyes snapped to hers, startled, as if he hadn't expected to be seen. He didn't answer, but his gaze drifted back to the food with a look of pure, raw hunger. Simone didn't need to hear his story to know it. She looked at her nearly empty containers, then back at the boy. Without a word, she turned back to the flame, pulling together the last of her ingredients to create a bowl of magic just for him. Would you like me to continue where Simone defends the boy from a rude customer? Subscribe Soblesseded Love Stories to get more of these stories. Back to where Simone defends the boy. The midday sun beat down on the pavement, but the atmosphere around Simone's stall turned frigid as a woman in a tailored silk dress marched to the front of the line. Heather Collins didn't look at the menu. She looked at Matteo, who was still clutching his empty bowl, with a sneer of pure disgust. Is this what passes for a business now? Allowing street urchins to loiter while paying customers wait. Heather's voice was like a jagged blade, cutting through the ambient noise of the market. She waved a manicured hand toward Matteo, whose small shoulders hunched forward as he tried to make himself invisible. Simone felt a familiar heat rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the griddle. "He's not loitering, ma'am," Simone said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "He's a child who was hungry, and I was helping him." I don't care about your charity work, Heather snapped, leaning over the counter. I want a ginger soy bowl. No carbs, extra vegetables, and make sure you don't use whatever cheap, greasy oil you people usually favor. The "you people" hit Simone like a physical blow, a calculated insult she had heard too many times in her life. She felt the familiar stutter of her heart, the words fighting to break free from her throat as her anger bubbled over. Actually, Simone said, her voice growing clearer and sharper, I'm almost out of food for the day. And even if I wasn't, I don't think I have anything that would suit your taste. Heather's mouth fell open. Excuse me? Do you have any idea who I am? I know you're someone standing in front of my stall disrespecting a child, Simone countered, her righteous anger finally taking the lead. This stall is my blood, sweat, and tears. I cook for people who appreciate it. If you can't handle waiting 2 minutes while I help a little boy, then you can take your business elsewhere. Heather sputtered, muttering a threat about calling the authorities before storming off on her designer heels. As the woman disappeared into the crowd, Simone turned back to Matteo. To her surprise, the boy wasn't cowering. He was looking at her with wide, shimmering eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. You're like a superhero, Matteo whispered, his voice filled with a reverence Simone didn't think she deserved. I'm just a woman who's had enough nonsense, baby, she sighed, reaching out to pat his hand. She didn't notice the black SUV idling at the curb, its windows so dark they were impenetrable to the light. Inside the vehicle, Luca Santoro watched the entire exchange on a tablet synced to the discreet cameras that had been following his son's adventure. He had watched as Matteo, the boy who hadn't connected with a single nanny or tutor in years, leaned into this woman's warmth. Luca's jaw tightened as he watched Simone stand her ground against a woman who represented the very world he usually navigated with violence. He saw the way his son looked at her, not with the wary distance he held for everyone else, but with a spark of genuine life. Enzo, Luca said, his voice a deep, commanding rumble that filled the car. Yes, boss? The driver asked, looking into the rearview mirror. She's the one, Luca murmured, his intense eyes never leaving Simone's face on the screen. She has the magic my son has been searching for. It's time we brought her home. The black SUV glided to the curb with the silent, predatory grace of a shark circling its prey. Simone felt the air in the market grow heavy, the usual street noise dying down as the back door opened. A man stepped out, and for a moment, Simone forgot how to breathe. He was powerful, with an athletic build that stretched the fabric of his luxury black suit, and his dark skin was framed by tight cornrow braids pulled back to reveal a face of sharp, masculine precision. His expression was a wall of cold, judging authority, and his intense eyes seemed to see right through the colorful facade of her stall into the very depths she was trying to outrun. He walked toward her with the confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Matteo's face lit up with a mixture of hope and nervousness as he jumped down from the crate where he'd been eating. Dad, the boy chirped, running to the man, who crouched down and opened his arms with a tenderness that made the violent temper people whispered about seem like a distant myth. You had quite an adventure today, little man, the man murmured before standing and turning that hard, intense stare back onto Simone. I believe you have something that belongs to me, he said, his voice a deep, commanding rumble that made Simone stand a little straighter. I was just feeding him. He looked lost, Simone managed to say, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling in the air. The man, Luca Santoro, stepped closer, and the scent of expensive cologne, warm, spicy, and dangerous, filled her small workspace. You didn't just feed him. You protected him. You stood up to a woman who thought she could buy your dignity for the price of a bowl of rice, he stated, his voice dropping to a personal murmur. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip thick with bills, peeling off several $100s and placing them on the counter without looking at them. Mr. Santoro, this is too much. The food was on the house, Simone stammered, her cheeks heating as the working-class pride she wore like armor began to flicker. It isn't for the food, Luca countered, his eyes boring into hers with a sudden, raw intensity. My son hasn't connected with anyone since his mother passed. He doesn't eat, he doesn't laugh, and he doesn't defend strangers. Until today. He paused, his jaw tightening. I have the best chefs and the most expensive doctors, but none of them could do what you did with a bowl of ginger soy chicken. Simone looked at Matteo, who was watching her with big, hopeful eyes. I'm just a cook, Mr. Santoro. I have a daughter, and I have a business to run. Your business is struggling, Simone. I know about the debts. I know about the 18-hour days, Luca said, his voice devoid of pity but full of an inescapable reality. He reached into his pocket and produced a simple, elegant business card embossed in silver. I'm not asking. I'm telling you that my son needs you. You and your daughter will come to my estate. I will pay you whatever you ask, and I will provide the protection you clearly need. You can't just force people into your life, Simone whispered, though the forced nature of the offer felt more like a lifeline she was terrified to grab. I can do whatever it takes to save my son, Luca replied, his voice softening just enough to reveal the desperate father behind the Mafia boss. Think about your daughter, Simone. Think about the life you could give her. I'll have a car at your door at 10 tomorrow morning. He turned and guided Matteo toward the SUV without waiting for an answer, leaving Simone standing in the heat, clutching a silver-embossed card that felt like it was already beginning to change her world. The next morning, Simone stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the fabric of her nicest cream-colored blouse and adjusting her pink silk bonnet. Her reflection showed a woman whose eyes were bright with a mixture of hope and bone-deep fear. Beside her, 7-year-old Zuri was a whirlwind of excitement, her purple pajamas replaced by her favorite sundress as she chattered about the big house they were going to visit. When the clock struck 10, a black town car, sleek, silent, and intimidating, pulled to the curb of their cramped apartment building. A driver named Gerald, dressed in a crisp uniform, opened the door with a practiced bow, collecting them as if they were fragile cargo. As the car glided away from the familiar, grit-stained streets of West Philadelphia, the scenery began to transform. The asphalt gave way to winding roads lined with ancient oak trees, and the houses grew into sprawling estates hidden behind iron gates. When they finally turned onto a private drive, Simone felt her jaw literally drop. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of stone and glass, a 3-story mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie about old money and family secrets. Gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, and a circular driveway featured a fountain that sparkled under the morning sun. Is this where we're going to live, Mommy? Zuri whispered, her eyes wide as she pressed her face against the tinted window. For now, baby, Simone replied, her voice barely audible over the hammering of her heart. To Zuri, it looked like a palace. To Simone, the high walls and security cameras felt like the bars of a golden cage. The car came to a stop in front of the massive main entrance, and before Simone could even reach for the door handle, it was opened from the outside. Luca Santoro stood in the doorway, a powerful silhouette against the marble foyer. He had traded his suit jacket for a black button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms and a sense of raw, athletic power. His feet were bare against the polished floor, a detail that made him seem dangerously real and intimately close. Welcome to my home, Simone, he said, his deep brown eyes finding hers and holding them with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Simone stepped out on legs that weren't entirely steady. Following him through the foyer was like walking into a museum. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and the marble floors were so polished she could see her own nervous reflection. They passed a living room larger than her entire apartment and a library filled with floor-to-ceiling books that smelled of old leather and quiet authority. Finally, they reached the kitchen, and for the first time since arriving, Simone forgot to be afraid. It was a chef's paradise, professional-grade stainless steel appliances, a 6-burner gas range, and marble countertops that stretched forever. An island sat in the center, larger than her entire kitchen back home. This is where you'll work, Luca said, watching her fingers trail over the smooth stone. My wife was the one who filled this house with life. Since she passed, it has been quiet. Too quiet. Before Simone could respond, a small blur of motion erupted into the room. Matteo skidded to a stop, his face split by the largest grin Simone had ever seen. He threw his arms around Simone's waist, nearly knocking her back. You came. Dad said you would, but I thought you might change your mind. Simone laughed, the tension in her chest finally beginning to crack. As she looked from the hopeful boy to the intense, watching man, she realized that while the cage was made of gold, the hearts inside it were desperately reaching for the warmth she carried in her hands. The following morning, the Bennett estate was silent until Simone stepped into the vast, state-of-the-art kitchen. The gleaming stainless steel and cold marble countertops felt more like a laboratory than a home. But Simone was determined to change that. She began by pulling fresh ingredients from the walk-in refrigerator. Plump stalks of green onions, pungent garlic, and a tray of chicken thighs, laying them out with the same rhythmic focus she used at her food truck. Matteo appeared in the doorway first, his large eyes wary but curious as he watched her work. Sensing his hesitation, Simone offered a warm smile and gestured for him to join her at the massive center island. "I'm going to need a top-tier assistant if we're going to get this right, Matteo," she said softly, sliding a small bowl of ginger toward him. "Do you think you can handle that?" The boy nodded eagerly, climbing onto a high stool. As Simone showed him how to gently peel the skin from the root, a shadow fell across the room. Luca stood in the entrance, his powerful frame leaning against the doorframe, his hard, intense stare tracking every move Simone made. He had traded his suit for a soft gray Henley that clung to his athletic build, yet his presence still felt like a command. "You're letting him help," Luca observed, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors. "Everyone has a role in my kitchen, Mr. Santoro," Simone replied, not looking up as she began to sear the chicken. The hiss of the pan and the fragrance of garlic soon filled the air, cutting through the sterile silence of the mansion. "Matteo, do you know why we talk to the food while we cook?" Matteo looked up, his mouth slightly open in surprise. "Because it's lonely." Simone laughed, a warm sound that made Luca's jaw tighten, not in anger, but in a sudden, unfamiliar response to the joy she brought with her. "Not quite, baby. It's because I believe love is an ingredient, too. The food can tell if you're just going through the motions or if you're cooking with joy." Matteo nodded with profound seriousness, carefully adding the ginger to the pan as if it were a precious treasure. Luca moved closer, his curiosity finally overriding his guarded distance. He watched as Simone leaned over Matteo, guiding his small hand to stir the sauce, her soft, feminine features glowing in the steam. "Is that what the specialists were missing?" Luca asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "They had the science, but not the love." "You can't measure heart in a measuring cup, Luca," Simone said, using his name for the first time. She looked up, and for a second their eyes locked. The electric tension between them was undeniable, a spark that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. Matteo doesn't need a nutritionist. He needs to feel like he belongs at the table. As the meal came together, the boy's silence finally broke. He began to ask questions, his voice rising with an excitement that Luca hadn't seen in years. Luca watched his son laugh, a genuine, chest-deep sound, and then looked back at Simone. He realized then that she wasn't just a cook he had forced into his world. She was the only person capable of bringing the light back into it. By the second week, the heavy, shadowed halls of the Santoro estate began to echo with a sound that had been absent for far too long: the high-pitched, unchecked laughter of children. Zuri and Matteo had hit it off immediately, bonding over a shared love for animated movies and a mutual, stubborn disdain for anything green on their dinner plates. They ran through the sprawling mansion like they had known each other for lifetimes, their footsteps thundering across marble floors that had previously only known the silent, rhythmic pace of security detail. Simone stood by the expansive kitchen window, a dish towel draped over her shoulder, watching through the glass as the two children played in the manicured garden. The setting sun was painting the estate in shades of gold and soft pink, casting long shadows across the tennis courts. She didn't hear Luca enter. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who was always on the hunt. It was only when he stepped up beside her, his powerful frame casting a shadow over the counter, that she felt the familiar, electric pull of his presence. "They're good together," Luca observed, his voice a deep, quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space between them. He wasn't looking at Simone. His hard, intense stare was fixed on his son, who was currently shrieking with joy as Zuri chased him toward the fountain. "They are," Simone agreed softly, a tired but genuine smile tugging at her full lips. "Zuri doesn't have many friends. Being the daughter of a woman who works 18-hour days doesn't leave much room for playdates. She's had to grow up faster than a 7-year-old should." Luca was quiet for a long moment, his arms crossed over his broad chest, the fabric of his black shirt stretching over his shoulders. The boss persona was still there, but it was cracking, revealing the father who had spent years watching his son fade away into silence. "Matteo was the same," Luca murmured, his voice dropping into a personal register Simone hadn't heard before. "After his mother died, he didn't just stop eating. He stopped being a child. I've spent 4 years providing him with everything money can buy, yet I couldn't give him that." He gestured toward the window just as Matteo tripped over a lawn ornament and Zuri doubled over laughing. For the first time, they weren't talking about salaries, schedules, or magic food. They were just two parents standing in a kitchen, united by the shared, heavy burden of raising children in worlds that weren't always kind. Mommy, Mateo won't share the swing. Zuri's indignant voice drifted through the open window, shattering the growing intimacy of the moment. Simone let out a soft laugh and moved to step away, but Luca's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward hers on the marble counter. Their fingers didn't touch, but the air between them crackled, a dangerous and thrilling tension that made Simone's heart pound against her ribs. "Let them figure it out for a minute," Luca said, his dark eyes finally turning to hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Everyone wants someone to see them, Simone. To really see them. You do that. You see people." Simone swallowed hard, her pulse quickening in a way she knew was dangerous. "I should go check on them," she stammered, her protective cynicism fighting a losing battle against the heat in his gaze. She practically ran from the kitchen, her cheeks burning, leaving Luca standing in the fading light, exhaling a long, slow breath into the sudden silence. Would you like me to continue where Luca reveals the scars of his past as their bond deepens? Subscribe to Soblessedlovestories to get more of these stories. Back to where Luca reveals the scars of his past. The evening rain tapped rhythmically against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library, a stark contrast to the heavy, thick silence shared between Simone and Luca. The room smelled of aged parchment and expensive bourbon, a scent that felt as masculine and unyielding as the man sitting across from her. Luca had traded his sharp suit for a simple black t-shirt that clung to his athletic build, but the relaxed attire didn't soften the hard, intense stare he leveled at the amber liquid in his glass. Simone sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, her pink silk bonnet removed for the evening, her pixie curls framing a face that looked slightly tired from a day of bridging the gap between two worlds. "She used to sit exactly where you are," Luca murmured, his voice a deep, commanding rumble that had dropped into a hauntingly personal register. He wasn't looking at Simone, but she could feel the weight of his memory filling the space. "My wife. She was the light in this house. The warmth. When she died 4 years ago, it was like the sun just went out." He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a raw vulnerability that momentarily shattered his cold, judging authority. "People see the braids, the suit, the power, and they think I'm a man of stone. But a man of stone can't raise a son who has forgotten how to smile." He reached up, his fingers tracing a faint, jagged scar near his temple, a remnant of a life lived in shadows and violence. "This world I lead, it's not for the faint of heart. I lost her to complications after surgery, but the life I live ensured I was never truly there to protect her when she needed me most. That is my true scar." Simone felt a lump form in her throat, the protective cynicism she had worn like armor for years beginning to crack. "I know what it's like to live with ghosts, Luca," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the rain. "I didn't lose my husband to death. I lost my life to a man who made me believe I was nothing." She looked down at her hands, the hands that moved with a rhythm born of years of practice and survival. "He cheated. Multiple times. I found out when another woman showed up at my door pregnant with his child." She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "I gave him 5 years and a beautiful daughter, and I walked away with nothing but my grandmother's recipes and a mountain of debt. I've spent every day since then standing over flames, sweating and praying that Zuri wouldn't notice how small our world had become," Simone continued, her mahogany eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm terrified, Luca. Terrified that this life, this house, is just another beautiful lie that's going to break my heart again." Luca stood up, his powerful frame moving with that silent, predatory grace, and stopped inches from her. He didn't reach out to touch her, but the electricity between them crackled, a dangerous and thrilling tension that made her breath catch. "You are not nothing, Simone," he said, his voice a vibrating bass that felt like a promise. "A woman who can make my son laugh after 4 years of silence is a woman who has more power than any man I've ever met." For the first time, the violent boss was gone, replaced by a man who saw her, really saw her, in a way that made her feel both valuable and entirely exposed. The golden glow of the formal dining room felt like a sanctuary, a world away from the rain-slicked streets and the ghosts of their pasts. Simone had outdone herself, preparing a surf and turf that filled the air with the rich, buttery scent of grilled lobster and garlic herb-crusted filet mignon. It was a meal designed for a celebration, yet the atmosphere was heavy with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the wine. Luca sat across from her, his powerful frame filling the high-backed velvet chair. For once, his hard, intense stare had softened, replaced by a gaze that lingered on the curve of Simone's smile and the way the candlelight danced in her mahogany eyes. "This is exceptional," Luca murmured, his voice a deep, vibrating bass. He took a slow, deliberate bite, his eyes closing in obvious pleasure. "I've had chefs from across the globe try to master this flavor. None of them could find the heart you put into it." Simone felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. "I told you, Luca," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "The food knows when it's loved. And tonight, I think we all needed to feel a little bit of that." The children had already been tucked away upstairs, their laughter replaced by the peaceful silence of the estate. For a fleeting moment, Simone allowed herself to believe that this golden cage could truly be a home. The space between her and Luca felt charged, a dangerous and thrilling pull that made her pulse quicken. He began to reach across the table, his hand moving toward hers as if to bridge the gap between their two worlds. Then, the sanctuary shattered. A sharp, high-pitched chirping erupted from the console on the sideboard. The security alert Simone had heard about but never witnessed. Suddenly, the soft amber lights of the dining room flickered and died, plunged into a terrifying, total darkness. Before Simone could even gasp, she felt a powerful hand grip her arm, pulling her out of her chair with an athletic speed that took her breath away. "Stay down. Get under the table." Luca's voice was no longer a murmur. It was a commanding, cold authority that brooked no argument. The silence was replaced by the muffled thud of heavy boots on marble and the sharp, rhythmic clicks of weapons being readied. From the hallway, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house like a gunshot. Simone crouched on the floor, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard she feared it would burst. The motherly warmth she carried was suddenly replaced by a raw, primal terror for Zuri. "Zuri! Matteo!" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Enzo has them. They're in the safe room," Luca hissed, his silhouette a dark, dangerous shadow against the faint moonlight. He pulled a compact, lethal-looking handgun from a holster she hadn't even noticed he was wearing. The billionaire father was gone, replaced entirely by the Mafia boss with a violent reputation. Through the doorway, Simone caught a glimpse of red laser sights dancing across the library walls. A security breach that proved Luca's world was built on a foundation of blood and high-stakes risk. She watched as Luca moved toward the door with a predatory grace, his intense eyes scanning the darkness for the threat. In that moment, the true danger of his world was laid bare. This wasn't just a house of marble and crystal. It was a fortress under siege. The fairy tale she had been beginning to believe in was reality-checked by the cold smell of gunpowder and the realization that loving a man like Luca meant living on the edge of a knife. "Would you like me to write the final chapter, where a ghost from Luca's past arrives to claim what's hers?" The chaos of the breach had barely settled into a tense, adrenaline-fueled silence when the front doors of the mansion were thrown open with a jarring finality. Simone stood in the shadows of the foyer, her hand still trembling from the cold weight of the reality she had just witnessed. The air, once filled with the scent of her cooking, was now sharp with the metallic tang of ozone and the heavy scent of rain trailing in from the driveway. A woman stepped into the light, her presence cutting through the room like a jagged blade. She was tall, slim, and moved with a terrifyingly flawless grace, her dark skin gleaming under the chandelier's light. She didn't look like a soldier or a rival. She looked like a queen returning to a throne she had never officially abdicated. Her designer dress was the color of a bruised plum, and her cheekbones were sharp enough to draw blood. "So," the woman said, her voice a smooth, cultured purr that carried a terrifying weight of condescension. "This is the magic I've been hearing about. The little street vendor who thinks she can play house in a fortress." Simone felt her spine stiffen, her maternal protectiveness rising to meet the woman's icy stare. "And you are?" The woman smiled, though the expression remained frozen in her eyes. "I'm Lydia Ashworth," she said, each syllable dripping with a sense of untouchable status. "I'm the woman who was promised to Luca before you were even a thought in his head. His fiancée." The word fiancée hung in the air like a death sentence. Simone felt the floor shift beneath her feet, the electric connection she had felt with Luca just moments ago now feeling like a cruel illusion. She looked toward the hallway where Luca stood, his hard, intense stare, fixed on Lydia with an expression Simone couldn't read. A mixture of shock, frustration, and a deep-seated history she was not a part of. Lydia didn't wait for an answer. She walked past Simone as if she were part of the furniture, her eyes scanning the marble foyer with a proprietary gaze. "You've let the place go, Luca," she remarked, her voice echoing through the silent halls. "It smells of common spices." We'll have to fix that once we get things back to the way they were meant to be. Simone looked at her hands, the hands that had fed a lost boy, the hands that had brought laughter back to a grieving child, and the hands that had almost been held by a billionaire mafia boss. In the presence of Lydia's polished, old-world authority, Simone felt the familiar weight of her working-class reality crashing down on her. She was a cook. She was a single mother with a mountain of debt and a food truck held together by grit. As Lydia turned her cold, judging gaze back toward her, Simone realized that the golden cage was finally closing its doors. Her future in the mansion, the safety of Zuri, and the fragile hope of a second chance at love were all suddenly in doubt. The ghost of Luca's past hadn't come to destroy the mansion. She had come to reclaim it, and she looked ready to sweep Simone and her magic food back into the streets where they belonged. Would you like me to continue with part 2 to see if Simone fights for her place, or if Luca's violent temper finally turns toward the woman from his past? Subscribe to Soblessedlovestories, drop your comment, like and share. See you for part 2.